to the area that I think more concerns me, and it is the area we've disagreed about in the past, which is the status of things like values and claims of right and wrong and good and evil, the ethics in the natural order. You have made much of this notion that you derived from Hume, that you can't get an ought from an is. But perhaps you'll prop that up. Like I, in the past, in my book, The Moral Landscape, and I think it was the TED talk I gave that you reacted to way back when, it was 2010. I claim to...
Oh my God, was it 2010? Really?
2010, yes. That's how quickly time flies. Right. So I claim that you can make ultimately rigorous scientific claims about right and wrong and good and evil. And I was arguing for a kind of what I would call a moral realism, which is to say that there are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, which can serve everything we could conceivably mean by right and wrong and good and evil. And these are naturalistic facts, and you can be right and wrong about them. And realism in this sense is the fact that there is a reality, whether you understand it or not. Your claims about it can be more or less right or wrong. It's possible not to know what you're missing. And I extend that to the domain of questions of value, right? And you are a fan of Hume's parsing of this matter, so perhaps give me the reasons why not from the Hume side, and then we can...
Sure. I think that there's two slightly different claims. One would be the claim that you can derive ought from is, which I think is just manifestly wrong. That's just logically wrong, right? By the rules of logic, garbage in, garbage out. Values in, values out, facts in, facts out. By using the rules of deductive logic, you cannot derive conclusions about properties that did not somehow appear in the axioms or the premises from which you did your logic. So I think that's just a non-starter. Now,
just to unpack that a little more. So yeah. Hume's claim was that there's no description of the way the world is. There's no factual description of the universe which can tell you how it ought to be or how you should act within it, right? So it's the oughts and shoulds get smuggled in. You have to add something that you want. You have to add a goal, say, and then on your account, science can tell you how to reach that goal. But the goal is something that the value-laden goal is something that you are smuggling in.
That's right. So Hume, I feel bad because late in life, I realized that Hume should have been my hero all along. One of the very few shortcomings of my philosophical undergraduate education was that I was at a Catholic university and Hume was the bad guy. So I didn't realize until much later that Hume was the good guy. However, bless his heart, he was not the clearest writer all the time. And he was the clearest thinker, but he was also mischievous. So he would make his points via dialogue or sarcasm or jokes. And the is and ought analysis is exactly that. It's not his most definitive, careful, logical piece of writing, because basically he's making fun of people who he thinks are making this mistake. He says, I'm reading people writing about what is true and is true, that's what he was aiming at. And then suddenly it's about what ought to be true, and it didn't come from anywhere. And so he kind of implies that you can't do it. And so I think that's right. I think that the conclusion, in that case, I would believe the strong conclusion, namely that in order to derive conclusions about what ought to be true or what should be true or what is morally right, we have to include in our theory an assumption or an axiom that relates to values, that relates to what is good and what ought to do. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim that you.
All right. So what I'm getting here is
that 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just gotta
include in our theory an assumption or an axiom that relates to values, that relates to what is good and what ought to do. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim that you can't do the logic from there. Now, even if you believe that claim, which everyone should believe.
What I'm getting so far is that Sam Harris feels like there is natural values and morals in the world, and Sean Carroll doesn't.
Yeah. Well, so Sam Harris says you can derive an ought from an is, which means you should be able to derive what ought to be from how something is. So, like, for example, red ought to be red because the way light, like, frequencies bounce off it the way that is in the vibrations of something being read. If that makes sense. So like
Yeah,
what
it does.
is yeah. And then what the other guy's saying, the best in summary, because I wrote this down, and what he said at the end is, in order to derive something that ought to be, we must include in fucking we must include an assumption in that theory of what ought to be. So like let's say with ethics, you have, this is just my understanding, I could be completely wrong. Um, in ethics, let's say you have, if you're trying to figure out morals or ethics for something, it's not just about what is, because you also have to take on the assumption of what you're considering the goal is with the moral values. So, like, if you're, it's kind of like the rules of a game. So, if you're playing like Monopoly, there's a whole set of rules and, you know, stuff that you follow to play the game fairly. Whereas if you're playing, I don't fucking know, Cluedo, there's a whole different set of rules to play the game fairly, because there's different goals and there's different um, things that are set up that you're going to be interacting with. So, from my understanding, what Sean Carroll is saying is that you have to make an assumption of some kind of assumption, whether it's what the goal is or what is the right thing originally to center your morals around, to even start coming up with an ethical framework, as opposed to just being able to derive an ethical framework from how things objectively are.
Yeah,
If that
I
makes
think that
sense.
I would actually agree probably with Sean Carroll over Sam Harris on this one, which I would almost think that they would have like reverse takes here. But so basically like what Sean Carroll is saying is like there really is no moral, um there are no like morals, right? Whereas Sam Harris is saying there are morals like built in, right? Like
Yeah,
okay, so should we you want to keep watching or
we can do. Yeah, I'm down.
You could still argue about moral realism versus anti-realism. It's totally possible to be a moral realist and a moral objectivist and still admit that you can't derive ought from is.
Yeah, so I've always viewed that little bit of Hume, and again, it is kind of an aside. It's not something he argues for at length, and yet people have made much of it in philosophy and in science. I viewed it as a kind of semantic trick which need not confine our thinking about these things. It's a little bit like Zeno's paradox. Zeno says, in order for an arrow to hit its target, it must move halfway to the target and then halfway again, and ergo it never arrives. But of course, arrows don't have to fly that way. Arrows can just fly all the way to the target. And if you want to if you need mathematics where you sum the infinite series, or you do find some way of nullifying that argument, fine. But it's set up as and it took hundreds of years for people to figure out why it's wrong. But it's an unnatural constraint imposed by, in that case, just the geometry of the situation. In Hume's case, it's just the meaning we're giving words like ought and should versus is. Now, I think, the other way to come at it from my point of view is you can give up all notion of ought and should. Let's say we're in the universe and there is no ought or should, or let's discover the oughts and shoulds. I mean, one question I have, which doesn't originate with me, I think many people oppose it this way, but if all the facts, if all the is claims in the universe aren't enough to give you some guidance as to how you ought to live, just what could give you that guidance, right? I mean, we're talking about the totality.
That's in my book.
Yes, yeah. So I think Dan Dennett has made this point, and others have. So that's worth wondering, right? It's like what extra piece would you be hoping for? But let's say there's no such thing as ought or should, or let's start there. It seems pretty clear to me that the ground truth of our circumstance as conscious beings is first consciousness. The something seems to be happening, where there's an experiential character to this place. And this experience admits of a range of possibilities that we have all dimly discovered parts of this range. We have had excruciating experiences and sublimely happy experiences, and we are trying to navigate toward the latter and away from the former, and helplessly trying. It's like the values come in put your hand on a hot stove, you will discover your value to get your hand off of it very early. You don't have to be reasoned into it. This is as incontrovertible as anything you can experience. There's certain things that you will just want to avoid. And so to take a more abstract picture, there is consciousness. There's the totality of actual and possible conscious minds that are open to this range of conscious experience. And the only thing I think I need to be a moral realist and for science ultimately to be the framework in which we talk about right and wrong and good and evil is to concede that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Right? If we should avoid anything, if we should do anything, we should get away from the worst possible misery for everyone. Every other state of the universe is better than that. If words like good and bad and better and worse are going to mean anything ever, having every possible conscious mind suffer as much as it possibly can for as long as it can to no good end, there's no silver lining, there's no lessons learned, this is just hell, right? That's bad and worth avoiding. And the answers as to how the minds involved would avoid this state are all ultimately scientific. In our case, we're talking about everything from genes on up to economic systems. We're talking about neurochemistry, we're talking about psychology, sociology, politics, whatever fact-based discussion we can have about how creatures like ourselves can flourish. That, and again, you and I may define science slightly differently. I'm not talking about narrowly operationalized lab-coded science, or I'm not talking about the equations we can write now to describe these systems. I'm not talking about data we necessarily can get right now with the machines available. But a fact-based discussion about all of the variables that spell the difference between excruciating and pointless misery on the one hand and sublimely creative, beautiful, joyful, as good as it gets conscious states on the other. And again, we don't know how far the horizons go in both directions. And this is why this is realism. Undoubtedly, there are horizons of conscious experience that we will never even imagine exist, but are possible for minds very different from our own. And we may one day build the artificial intelligences that experience.
I feel like it's going on too long. So what's your take on this?
It's kind of odd because in a weird way, I agree with both of them in the sense that, so I think I agree that you can derive ought from is, like in the sense that I think subjectivity kind of arises out of just incredibly complex, nuanced, objective systems, if that makes sense. Like I think everything can be objectively stated and understood, but I think subjectivity enters the picture when when something that we're trying to analyze or understand or make sense of is so complex and has so much nuance to it, to the point where we can't take in all the information to understand it objectively, if that makes sense. And so in a sense, I agree with the fact that morals are subjective in that I agree with that morals can be subjective in the sense that I think reality can present itself in an infinite number of ways. Therefore, morals can arise in an infinite number of ways, making them subjective. Because you also have to take into account how things are perceived, because if we are taking into consideration, as Sam Harris says, better and worse, people perceive different things as better and worse. So not only do we have the objective world, but we have all these different perceptions of this world happening, with vastly different, naturally occurring, each objective moral frameworks popping up in their own perceptions. And those are going to clash and stuff, obviously. So I think it's subjective in the sense that I think subjectivity is just an incredibly nuanced amount of objectivity, but it's objective in the sense that I think everything kind of has an objective conclusion to it, but that the conclusions are infinite. Therefore, you can infinitely go with any specific conclusion, meaning that you can go with any answer, which is therefore subjective, if any of that makes sense.
I mean, it's pretty confusing. I don't think I'll be able to. I think I got what you were saying, but like basically, like it's kind of like what you're saying. If you had all of the information, like there's too much information to have in order to understand. Um,
Yeah.
but if you were able to have all the information, you think that we would be able to come to like a correct answer?
Uh, to a degree, if we had all the correct information, if we could perceive all of it, then I think you could come up with an objective answer. But at the same time, because the world is perceived in a different way by every single conscious being, each different world that exists in each different person's mind is going to have different conclusions that come out of the way in which that thing exists in relation to this insanely complex structure. Because everything has its role. Like you can't say objectively, like so big. We know like the physics and quantum physics they react differently. So like the quantum shit doesn't have to act in the same way that the large shit does, even though they're both part of the same world. Do you know what I'm saying? So like my moral system doesn't have to align with your moral system, and they can both be objectively true in the way we should act as our part of who we are as this piece of this whole system. But it doesn't have to align as the same thing. It just has to be true to this piece of the universe that we are.
Yeah, I mean, well, in terms of just like morality in general, can't you pretty much say like if you're religious and you believe in God, then God has kind of given us morals to follow. But if you're not religious, then there really are no morals. Can you simplify it that much, like to
I
basically
don't
be like if
I don't think so, no. Because
well, but if there's no God, if we just came about by the Big Bang and evolution, why would there be morals? Like
well, why would there
no
be
one.
anything?
Well, no, but I mean, morals is something that humans have kind of just made up, right? So, like I have my
Well,
morals, you have your morals, but like, there's no universal morals, right?
but
Because, like you
but the
said, someone
sorry.
someone else's morals might be different than mine. So there's no we can't like come to a conclusion on this is right and this is wrong because there's no God that's told us that, right?
But the thing is, the morals that we develop, they stem from somewhere, like they grow from something. So, like, let's say originally morals were stemming from the fact of like, it is, let's say me and you were primal fucking motherfuckers out in the wild. We bump into each other. We decide it's going to be mutually beneficial for us to work as a team and develop this like tribe. We find other people, we bring them in, and we develop this tribe. Morals start to develop to keep us getting along with each other. That would be my guess as to why we develop some kind of ethical framework. So we get along, we don't annoy each other, we don't fucking kill each other. Um, but and that seems like something that we've made up, and in a way we've made it up, but it also does stem from the reactions of like we're in this environment where the external environment is dangerous to us. That's an objective fact of how things are. And so because of that, that pushes us to work together. And because we've been pushed to get to work together because of these pre-existing things as a kind of effect of this cause, as a kind of causal effect thing, then we are forced to create these morals and ethical frameworks so we can get along. And yes, we've made that up, but that is a reaction that the kind of you know that the universe has done. It's not just that we've done it as a part of the natural order of the way in which the universe falls into place because we are
Yeah, but I
subject
don't
to
know.
that.
I don't know if I would necessarily still say that's like morals. I feel like that's like more of like a cultural understanding of, or like maybe laws. You can say like I don't feel like laws are necessarily morals. Like one
Yeah,
law
I
doesn't necessarily right, and another law is necessarily wrong. Um, I'm talking about like just true right and wrong. Like who says what is right and what is wrong, and what you're talking about is more of like let's agree to live by a set of laws, which I don't think are necessarily the same as
well
morals.
no, because well, the thing is with laws is the point of laws is to maintain what we say is we have laws so we can maintain justice, we can bring justice. And why would you need to bring justice, right? You find out whether someone's innocent or guilty. If they're innocent, then what does that imply? If they're guilty, what does that imply? If they're guilty, then they've at least definitely, from this system we've created, the point was meant to at least be that they've done something wrong. And if they're innocent, that means they either haven't done something wrong or they haven't done something wrong enough to deserve any justice to be taken. So
But
I
it's like
think I
maybe
think
they've done something wrong in the eyes of the majority, I guess. But it's like they haven't necessarily like what's the word like when it's there's stuff that like we've made up and there's stuff that's like kind of like natural law or whatever. I forgot what the word I'm thinking of is, but basically like anything that we've basically made up our own morals. It's not
construct,
natural.
like a social construct.
Yeah, like a social construct, but there's another word too. I'm forgetting it. But basically, yeah, it's like a social construct that we've. What I'm talking about is more like a kind of like a natural law. Like there's real no natural law among animals, right? It's just like we've made up the law system, and some people might agree with the system, and some people might not agree with the system. And not only that, but if somebody gets charged guilty, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are guilty. It just means that a group of individuals,
Well,
a jury decided that they were,
but would
or
you
a
would you
judge.
would you agree that there are laws that the universe follows? Like there are laws of the universe.
Well, only the physical laws of the universe, right? I mean, those are like the
Yeah.
really only laws, right? Is the physical
But
laws of the universe, like gravity, and that has nothing to do with morals, right?
but if there are physical laws of the universe, and do I assume you also believe that we are made of that physical stuff. We are made of the physical matter.
Yeah.
So therefore, are we and everything else not dictated by those physical laws, including the constructs that we create, stemming out of that?
Yeah.
So therefore, if those physical laws are objective, then everything is objectively necessarily created as part of the causal effect chain of the universe in physics.
But like just because we created something doesn't necessarily mean that it's kind of like the same thing with yeah, just because we created something doesn't necessarily mean that it's a natural law.
I think anything, maybe the word natural isn't the right word, but I think everything that happens is it's a part like we like to separate ourselves from like the natural way of how things are and stuff, but at the end of the day, we are a product of everything that is natural. And in the same way bees create honey and fucking beavers create dams, we create technology and medicine and we create all these things. Like it's no different. We just do it on a more like kind of complex scale, but it's the same thing. And each different one of those things, including us and the bees, are all doing it as a natural causal effect response to just the natural physical laws of how things are.
Yeah, but I still don't think that like justifies a right or a wrong because kind of going back to what they were saying, it's like what we were talking about, what they were saying is it's like there is what's right for one person might be wrong for another person. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
just because I think it's wrong to steal, let's just say, someone else might think it's not wrong. Right.
But
So who's
but
right in that situation?
but can only one of them be right? Does either one of them have to be wrong or right?
Well, no, that's the main thing though. That's the main question with the morals is there a wrong or a right?
I guess from that, is it all right or is it all wrong, or is there some that are right? Because either there's some that are wrong and some that are right, or they either all have to be wrong or all have to be right, or all just be neutral. And if they're all neutral, get off the keyboard, then they might as well all be considered right. And then you could claim, well, murder is right, or child rape is right, or whatever. Which I know, let me clarify. I'm not trying to trap you in a corner here. I very much know you do not think child rape is right.
No. I know, but that's the whole thing, though. Is you can go back to some cult. I mean, I don't know if any cultures really think that murder or child rape is right, but I know that like back in where was it, Greece or something, like Romans would molest kids, right? And it's like, or whatever, like, and they didn't really necessarily think it was wrong, right? I mean, I'm sure
Hmm.
some cultures that type of stuff happens and they don't necessarily think it's wrong. And especially if you go way back in the day, like, yeah, like, um,
There's cultures now that will I think they think if you it's fucked up. I shouldn't laugh. They think if you rape an old woman, you gain her wisdom, and if you rape a child, I think they think you gain their innocence. I think very fucked up, but that's like a modern day thing that happens in some. I think it's some South African tribes. I may be getting that wrong though.
well,
Um,
that's what I'm saying. Like, if in certain tribes it's okay to do these certain things,
yeah,
who makes
but
them wrong and who makes us right?
yeah, it's weird, and this is where it's like I don't know because it's weird because as I said earlier, I think it's both objective and subjective in different ways. I think if you kind of follow along a path of one argument long enough, you will just end up back at the other argument. But then if you keep following it, you end up back at the other. So I don't think I guess there both isn't ever a right or wrong answer. I don't think.
Yeah, well, that's the original question, and it's like, of course, I think that raping children or killing somebody or is wrong. Like, I'm just arguing
Yeah,
that I'm arguing the other side. What I'm saying is I don't think there's necessarily any universal moral right or wrong. I think that we've made our own, we've come to our own decisions as a culture and society and even individual, but I don't necessarily think that there's someone above judging, saying you did the right thing, you did the wrong thing, right?
I think I think it's all right. I think that everything that does happen necessarily had to happen. So I think it's all right.
Well, it's not necessarily all right. It just all kind of is. I mean, I see what you're saying, but it's not necessarily a right or wrong. I think it just is, right?
It is, yeah, it kind of is just what it is, but
Yeah.
it is also for everything to exist how it is. I think everything had to be the way it is and go the way it is. So I guess I'm putting value on things being, I guess, which isn't inherent and is also subjective. So yeah, I guess it just is. It's kind of all neutral.
Yeah. I could go down this rabbit hole forever,
Yeah,
but
this got
I want to,
weirdly fucking philosophical, almost
which no, I,
theological.
I like, but it's like I don't want to take up the whole time doing that unless
Yeah, I feel like I just took acid.
no, I like those debates for sure. But